Presenting the 1900s, a decade of consequence. The 20th century is often called the American century, or the triumphant century. But where does this implied epic begin? In its beginning, its first decade, we see the makings of modern America and its might, glory, and mistakes. We see events and factors of consequence that will either aid the nation or present a challenge. This pivotal decade opened up with the decisive re-election and then subsequent assassination of President William McKinley, a popular figure of the prior decade who led the nation to victory in a war against the Spanish Empire. With McKinley slain by Polish-American anarchist Leon Czolgosz, the nation found itself facing a new titan. Enter Theodore Roosevelt. Colonel Roosevelt, as he preferred to be addressed, was hailed by the nation as a war hero and symbol of America's new expanded role on the world stage. With the rise of Roosevelt came his view of what a model democracy is, a nation that is militarily strong and socially just. Under the leadership of the Colonel, the United States continued to maintain an active presence on the world stage, with the issuing of the infamous Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting U.S. desire to involve itself in the affairs of other nations, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Under this approach, Roosevelt applied what he called big stick diplomacy and intervened in the Venezuela crisis of 1902, causing the latter nation to pay their debts while preventing an invasion by several European powers. He would also successfully mediate the end of the Russo-Japanese War and the first Moroccan crisis. But perhaps the greatest symbol of big stick diplomacy was Roosevelt's expansion of the United States Navy, taking it from being the fifth largest in the world to the third largest, making it competitive with the premier powers of the world, Britain and Germany, a fact he exploited with his round-the-world tour of the gleaming, glistening, and fearsome Great White Fleet. At home, the American giant became a great patron of the growing progressive movement. He embraced the proposed reforms of muckraker Upton Sinclair in his advocacy and signing of both the Pure Food and Drug Law and the Meat Inspection Act, mandating government labeling and inspection of all foodstuffs, medicine, and packaged meat in the country. Roosevelt would establish himself as an avid conservationist, setting aside 230 million acres in the creation of the national park system. But when Roosevelt wasn't beating up on nations abroad, he was beating up on corporate monopolies or trusts at home. He oversaw the passage of the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, which expanded the federal government's regulatory power of trusts. One of the more noted trusts he busted was none other than J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company. Roosevelt would also use his self-described bully pulpit to involve himself in the relationship between business and labor, intervening in the anthracite coal strike of 1902, in which he successfully mediated the affair between business, which managed to prevent collective bargaining rights for the union, while labor received wage increases and a shorter work time. By the end of Roosevelt's presidency, he continued to push a harder line on the upper class of America, and trusts pushing for a radical agenda in 1907, which included advocacy for a national incorporation law, federal income tax, inheritance tax, and campaign reform laws. This approach would continue to flare the mood of American politics for the next decade, and would be clearly present in Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, who bore an impressive trust-busting record. When the trusts weren't being busted by Roosevelt and Taft's big stick, they were producing most of America's goods. The Ford Motor Company was organized in 1903, for example. Cars were being produced using assembly lines and giving many people jobs. At first, they were only owned by the rich. Of course. But then, the car became more popular and spread through the general population by the 1920s. It became more cheaper and accessible. The sale of automobiles depended on the economy. Selling more in times of prosperity put more people to work. And speaking of work, boy did everyone need its wages. So much so, families actually sent their kids to get them. Child labor grew with more industrialized urban areas and factories. Children were preferred as they were more cheaper and more manageable. The National Child Labor Committee was organized in 1904 concerning with the problems of working children. Go figure. With the need for work also came the need for workers, a need that was supplied by immigrants. During the 1900s, the urban population was increasing, part from more immigrants coming into the country. Most of the immigrants at the time were Eastern and Southern Europeans. This period is often known as the Great Wave of Migration. Although the population was increasing, the living conditions of the poor were terrible. There was also segregation against immigrants. In the Gentleman's Agreement, Japan agreed to stop sending immigrants, while Theodore Roosevelt agreed to stop segregation of the Japanese in the city of San Francisco. One issue that saw little improvement during this era of glory progressive change was segregation of African Americans, which was still common at this time. W.E.B. Du Bois, a civil rights leader, founded the Niagara movement in 1905. It was a more radical approach, wanting immediate equality. They went against racial oppression, demanded free speech, press, and suffrage. The NAACP was founded in 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois being one of the founders. One of the great cultural advents of this decade, it was the writing of the well-known classic of today, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. It was written in 1900 and quickly became a favorite amongst children of the time period. Little known, it is also a political satire of the issue bimetallism, which is a very popular and controversial issue of the decade prior. Another great cultural advent was the filming of the first silent movie, The Great Train Robbery, which was shot, filmed, and directed, and released in 1905.